Great. All right. Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry. I'm just going to let Aitha be a co-host. All right, we'll try that again. Hi, everyone. My name is Leigh Raithby. I am the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at Results Canada and a member of Stop TB Canada's Secretariat team. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Research and Development Game Changers to End Tuberculosis. I'd like to start by paying respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of the land where the Office of Results Canada is located in Ottawa. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. As we explore today's topics, let us remember that as long as we allow TB to disproportionately persist among Indigenous communities, we are failing to provide the most basic level of justice to these people, let alone reconciliation. Please keep your mics muted and use the chat to ask questions and share comments throughout the presentations. And then there will be an opportunity at the end of the call to unmute and ask your questions directly to the speakers. We have an exciting lineup of experts joining us on today's call to provide an overview of the research and development, or R&D, landscape for TB, including an assessment of how global TB R&D investments to date compare to the financial need identified in the new global plan to end TB. We'll hear about game changers in development across TB vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, as well as current barriers to progress that are impeding TB elimination efforts. Together, the speakers will illustrate the promising innovations in this field and highlight the need for increased funding to support such developments. Following the presentations, I'm going to be highlighting our current campaign and our asks of Canada ahead of the United Nations high-level meeting on TB that's happening this September, namely our ask for Canada to announce increased investments in TB R&D to support the development of new and improved tools to prevent, diagnose, and treat TB. So we'll invite you to join us in calling on Canada to step up as a leader in the quest to end TB by helping us put pressure on the government to fulfill previous commitments to TB elimination with concrete and high-impact action. Near the end of the call, we'll have some time for you to ask questions to our expert speakers, so please make note of any questions that come up as we go through the presentation. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts joining us today, including Mike Frick, the co-director of the TB program at Treatment Action Group, who will be providing an overview of the TB R&D landscape and set the stage for the subsequent presentations. We have Dr. David Lewinsohn, a professor of medicine and the chair of the Stop TB Partnership Working Group on New TB Vaccines, who will be highlighting some current innovations in TB vaccine development and the impact that a new TB vaccine would have on TB elimination efforts. We have Karishma Saran, the Senior Manager of Advocacy and Communications at Fine Diagnostics, who will be talking about ongoing developments to improve the diagnostic tools that we have to detect TB. And then we also have Anna Maria Harkins, the Director of External Affairs at TB Alliance, who will be exploring some of the developments across TB treatment regimens and the impact that will have. So clearly we have a lot to get through today, so I will pass it over to Mike to kick us off. Mike, over to you. You can share your screen.
All right. Thank you very much, Leigh. Good morning, everybody. Let me just pull up my slides, get these situated. A big thank you to Stop TB Canada and Results Canada for bringing us together today. And good morning to everybody from New York. And I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on land belonging to the Lenape people. What I hope to do is provide context for the presentations that follow by giving you an introduction to the TB research and development landscape, focusing on funding for TB research, both global funding and then funding provided by the Canadian government. So I think the best place for us to start is with promises that have been made in this area. In 2018, the United Nations held a high-level meeting on tuberculosis, and governments came together in that year and made a commitment that they would jointly raise at least $2 billion a year for TB research. And the promise took the form of the text on the slide here, which was how this was represented in the political declaration that was passed at that meeting. And in addition to the money, raising $2 billion, they also said that they would work together and ensure that all countries contribute appropriately to TB research and development. And I've highlighted that text because I'm going to come back to that toward the end of the presentation to talk about what appropriate contribution is for Canada and for other countries. So the promise was $2 billion, and quickly that promise was broken. Each year since 2005, TAG and Stop TB Partnership have conducted a global survey of what the world spends on TB research each year. The survey goes out to government funders, private sector, pharmaceutical companies, multilateral organizations, philanthropies, and we produce an estimate of TB research expenditures. And we can see from the data, which are in blue here, that over time, annual funding for TB research and development has somewhat steadily increased, but still this falls more than halfway short of the $2 billion goal set by the UN. So in fiscal year 2021, which is the last year for which we have data, global funding for TB research totaled just over $1 billion US, which is only 50% of that $2 billion promise. And what concerns us is that when you take inflation into account, that 1 billion is actually a lot less in terms of its purchasing power, and that's represented by the yellow line here. So we are raising nominal dollars for TB research. We're not quite keeping pace with inflation, and we're falling below the promises that we've made to ourselves. And this is the situation that we find ourselves in. When we look and break that global funding figure down and look at the money that's going to different areas of TB research, we can see that every area of TB research and development is underfunded, whether we're talking about basic science on TB, the development of diagnostics, drugs, or vaccines, what the other speakers will address. And the Stop TB Partnership has set funding targets for each of these areas of TB research. This is a graph showing you what those targets look like over a 5-year time horizon in red. And then the blue is what we've actually spent over 2018 to 2021 against those targets. So you can see that there are sizable gaps in every area of TB R&D. And the gap in financing between available spending and projected financing needs is wider for TB vaccines than for any other TB research area. And so to stick on the TB vaccine funding picture for just a moment, I wanted to call this out as a particular need because we know that there will be no end to the TB epidemic unless we develop new vaccines against TB. The pie chart on this slide shows you what the world spent on TB vaccine research in 2021. It added up to just $120 million. You can see who some of the largest players were: the US NIH, the Gates Foundation, and some European funders among the top 5. And of every dollar spent on TB vaccines in 2021, 62 cents of that came from public funders, 31 from philanthropies, just a little bit from the private sector, and there were no reported investments in TB vaccines from multilateral donors, which could be organizations like CEPI or Gavi or others active in the vaccine space. And 120 million is not very much. And in fact, it's like barely detectable if you put it against what the world spent on COVID-19 vaccine development. If you add up everything that we've spent on TB vaccines over sort of the last decade plus, 2009 to 2021, you get a figure around 1.3 billion. And this is just 1% of the estimated 100 billion that the world spent on COVID-19 vaccine research to develop those vaccines and bring them to market in just the first year of the pandemic. So we're working on a completely different scale than we are for pandemics like COVID. The problem with broken promises is that they create a heavier lift for the future. And underspending in previous years means that we now need to spend more in coming years in order to make up funding shortfalls. And at the same time, our needs have grown because TB science has progressed to a point where additional money is going to be required over the coming years. We have next generation diagnostics, many developed for COVID that we need to evaluate for TB. We have multiple vaccine candidates that need to be studied in late-stage trials that will be very expensive. And TB drug development is in a whole new place than it was a decade ago and has a big research agenda that needs to be finished. And so all of this led Stop TB Partnership and its partners to realize that moving forward, we actually need to be spending more than $2 billion a year on TB research. And so in the global plan to end TB, Stop TB Partnership has called on the world to mobilize $40 billion in financing for TB research and development over the next 8 years, or what works out to around $5 billion annually. So we've moved from a $2 billion annual target to a $5 billion annual target. And this is going to require that existing funders of TB research give more, and that we bring new funders into the field to create a greater diversity of funders investing in this area. And it's going to require that all countries play their part to support TB research to meet what we and other advocates have begun to call the fair share targets for TB research financing. And I want to just take a moment to introduce these fair share targets. And this brings me back to that text I highlighted on the first slide, where the promise of $2 billion a year was accompanied by a commitment that all countries contribute appropriately to TB research and development. We wanted to take this language, which was a little vague, and put some specificity behind it as advocates and define what appropriate contribution looks like. And we decided that appropriate contribution could be defined as each country giving its fair share to TB R&D. And fair share is defined in relation to the annual target, whether it's $2 billion a year or $5 billion a year. It basically breaks down that global target into national targets. It says, what is Canada's share of $5 billion? What is the United States share of $5 billion? And so on, creating a specific concrete ask for national level advocacy. And the fair share targets are set not just in relation to that annual target, but also taking into account what countries already spend on R&D, which is sort of a measure of their capacity to contribute to TB research. And this overall spending on R&D is a figure called GERD, which stands for Gross Domestic Expenditure on Research and Development. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you the fair share targets and how this all worked out in terms of the math. In 2018, when we were working toward $2 billion a year for TB research, we set the fair share targets at 0.1%. So that meant that we were calling on each country to devote 0.1% of what it spends on all forms of research and development to TB research and development specifically. Now that we need to raise $5 billion a year for TB research, we have increased the fair share targets to 0.15% of overall R&D expenditures for TB R&D. So that is, each country must devote 0.15% of its overall spending on R&D to TB research. And on this next slide, I'm showing you what this looks like in dollar terms for Canada at the top of this graph, and for some sort of peer countries or other countries where advocates are active in talking to their governments about TB R&D. So the middle column is showing you actual spending as reported to TAG and Stop TB Partnership in 2021. And then the far column is showing you what the 0.15% fair share target is. So to take Canada as an example, in 2021, based on reports sent to TAG and Stop TB, we identified just under $17 million in spending from the Canadian government on TB research and development. But Canada's fair share target under 0.15% would be around 52 million. So you can identify a gap that needs to be made up, the difference between actual spending and what the fair share targeted spending would be, and that provides an ask for national level advocacy. In the United States, the fair share target is under 0.15% over $1 billion a year, and the United States government in 2021 was spending around $416 million a year. So there are some sizable increases between actual spending and targeted spending that we're going to have to achieve in order to meet these targets. And we know that they're not going to happen in like a single budget cycle or a single appropriation year. But we can track progress toward fair share targets over time, and giving us a kind of sense of progressive realization of these promises that we're setting for ourselves. So here I wanted to just show you what Canadian support for TB research and development has looked like over the past 5 or 6 years. The 2022 data will report this year in December. And between 2016 and 2021, Canadian funding for TB research has fluctuated somewhere between around $17 million and $20 million. Most of this funding has come from Global Affairs Canada and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Global Affairs Canada always being the largest funder for TB research and development in Canada each year. Most of this funding, all of it actually, has gone to support operational research that is managed by Stop TB Partnership through the TB Reach program. So sizable funding, but very narrowly targeted toward one specific program. And then CIHR funding supports a wide array of academic research in Canada at Canadian universities, and really spans the whole continuum of basic science through product development. The reason that we are so focused on setting fair share targets for governments is because most money for TB research is public money. And that's why I think the campaign Leigh alluded to is so important. So we know that in any given year, about 70% of what is spent on TB research comes from the public sector, followed by philanthropies, the private sector, and then multilateral institutions making up the difference. And so with so much of our research investments dependent on the public, we need a framework that allows us to speak to governments about what they need to contribute. But we also recognize that governments aren't the only players. And so within this fair share framework, there is room to talk about setting research funding targets for private sector, for philanthropies, for non-state actors, and thinking about ways that government can work together with these different types of institutions to support TB research in a way that ensures equitable access to the benefits of that research and the products that we're developing. So with that, I just want to close with one last thought, which is there has been lots of talk about TB benefiting from COVID-19 research spending, or how do we get a share of what has been spent on COVID-19 research. And I think that sometimes there's a tendency to think about this in terms of like a trickle down model, like maybe we'll get a few drops of what was spent on COVID-19 for TB. Sometimes we can think about how research in one area may have ripple effects that are felt or benefit other areas. So a COVID-19 diagnostic tool, for example, being repurposed for TB would be an example of a ripple effect. But I think we need to start talking about the broad benefits of TB research and recognize the ways that a dollar spent on TB would travel far beyond the primary research field in ways that are somewhat unexpected and maybe very difficult to predict and quantify. And that when we spend money on TB research, there are cross-disease benefits, tools, concepts, capacity, infrastructure that we had already invested in for TB was enormously helpful for responding to COVID-19. And I think that investments in TB research can help us prepare for the next airborne pandemic, whatever it is. So moving from a model of seeing us getting trickled down from COVID or benefiting from ripple effects to recognizing that actually an investment in TB is an investment in resiliency. We're creating these networks of mutual benefit when we support TB research and doing a lot of things with those dollars. So with that thought, I will just say thank you and pass it back to Leigh for the next speakers. And just to say, if you think we're missing data from Canada when it comes to research spending, let us know, because our survey is running right now and it's not too late for us to correct anything that we've overlooked. So thank you so much, and back to you, Leigh.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was an incredibly helpful overview of today's topic and really sets the stage for our next presentation. So thank you for that. So we're going to start with our presentation on TB vaccine development by Dr. David Lewinsohn. So I will pass it over to you, David, and you can share your own screen.
Sorry, I was on that. Can you guys hear me now? I'm going to get the presenter mode. There we go. There we go. Can you guys see that?
Yes, we can still see the side slides.
Oh, good. Okay. Oh, you can? Oh, shoot. So you don't see it as a slide?
If you just go to the bottom right, there should be a little slideshow icon.
Oh, that's what I'm doing.
Oh, maybe it's just on my side. I mean, we can still see the slide, so.
Okay, that's not better. No. All right, let me shoot. Okay. Well, I don't want.
It's not the worst. If you want to just go on, we can just
I
see the
think I'll
slides on
just
the
go.
slide.
So first of all, I want to thank you guys for doing this. This is really exciting. And I also want to thank Mike for really covering a lot of really important ground. And just to sort of point out, and I just want to kind of highlight, these slides largely came from both myself and Sean Palmer, who's been one of the kind of co-organizers of TB Vax Arm, which is a relatively new advocacy group that includes Results, TAG, IAVI, the partnership, as sort of an advocacy group for vaccines. So if anyone's interested in that, please send me a note and I'll get you guys signed up for that as well. Okay, so these are the things that I often hear, which I think are really important sort of tackle, especially as advocates. So first of all is, don't we already have a vaccine? And I've heard this a lot from TB survivors who are like, I didn't think I was going to get TB because I had the BCG vaccine. Will these vaccines really work? And can we afford them? So let me just talk about BCG to start off with. So these are just 3 examples of vaccines, and there's actually many other examples.
Sorry, David, I don't think your slides are switching. I'm not sure if it's just for me.
Oh, really?
I can still see your title slide.
Oh, shoot. I'll tell you, maybe I'm sharing the wrong thing.
I can also share your slides if that's easier. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Is that better?
Yeah, we're on the BCG slide now.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Perfect, thanks. And it's full screen. Amazing.
Wow. Okay. I know you'd think after all this time with Zoom that I have this figured better. So anyway, these are just 3 examples. There's more. And what's amazing about vaccines, and I sort of think backwards and think, what have we done in public health that really mattered? And clean water would be number 1. Number 2 is probably vaccines. And these are just 3 examples of introducing vaccines and then asking what happened to the prevalence of those diseases over time once those were introduced. And it's really stunning, whether it's polio, pertussis, measles. I think COVID is going to be another example. That what you appreciate is that when we introduce an effective vaccine, the disease kind of goes away. Does that work? Could we just switch? Yay.
Yes.
Okay. So this is TB, and you guys have all seen this. This is from the Global TB report from 2021. And you can see the kind of slight uptick that it was probably the result of diversion of resources away from TB to COVID. And I think Mike just highlighted the ways in which the infrastructure that we as the TB community have built have been so effective. And yet what you can see is that over all this time, we've seen, if anything, really modest decreases in TB. And it's been estimated that if we just keep doing what we do now, it's going to be about 200. And the thing I'd like to highlight, and it's really nice to see that we're going to have speakers from all these areas, that it would be really, really naive to think that only one new tool, only one intervention is going to be the one that makes all the difference. And so obviously, and Mike kind of touched on this as well, whether it's a new TB vaccine, better drugs that shorter regimens and less toxicity, point of care diagnostics, all of which are going to be really required to end TB. So this is a really nice graphic that was put together for the report that was done by Tess Reichman and David Dowdy. And I think this really gets to Mike's earlier point that sort of inaction does not come without cost. And this is a graphic that we call the cost of inaction, which on the top bar is sort of doing what we do now. And you see this very modest decrease in TB prevalence over time. If we sort of really did what we know how to do now, just better and more efficiently, you can see that we do bend the curve downward somewhat, but we really need to have new tools to really deflect that curve. And what's important about this is that for each year that we don't do anything, that ultimately becomes increasing costs for having not done that in the first place. And so, and these new tools, I mean, I think the modeling would sort of show that either a TB vaccine or TB preventative strategies, which are both drugs and diagnostics, are both essential in really bending that curve downwards. So and getting to the point of whether this is possible or not, I think we're living through a really exciting time in TB vaccine development. And I will highlight a couple of these studies, but this is just highlighting the final analysis of the M72 AS01E vaccine. And I'll show you that one in just a moment. We have some indication that we can actually prevent infection using BCG revaccination, some very exciting animal modeling that's sort of highlighting kind of new concepts in the field. And so I think what this argues is that, yes, we can in fact develop efficacious vaccines. And I find this incredibly exciting. And if you guys remember what happened with the MBA trial that came out, the field was really gloomy. And do I think that these are all going to be the final answer? Do I think that one vaccine is going to be adequate? I think almost certainly not. I think it's likely we're going to need different vaccines for different populations, different age groups, et cetera. But this really shows us that this actually can be done. So what I think this highlights is that right now we are at a critical moment in TB vaccine design. We can see that these early studies actually show us that new approaches can prevent infection and disease. And I'm going to show you that we only have 15 or so candidates. And even though this is a growing pipeline, what I think Mike already highlighted is that the gap in our ability to put these forward is really lacking. So this is the full TB vaccine pipeline that was put together by the Stop TB Partnership in consultation with both TAG and the WHO. And there's a couple of things here that are very striking. So this sort of goes from phase 1, which are studies that are just beginning to get into human trials, to phase 3, where we're actually beginning to look at true efficacy trials that would lead to licensure. And this is a really crazy pipeline in the sense that we have very few candidates entering phase 1 and early stage phase 2 trials. And this is really the opposite of what you'd love to see in a really robust pipeline. That is, you'd like to see lots of candidates that are kind of coming forward, knowing that not all of them will work. So I look at this pipeline and I'm very frightened at the fact that we have so few phase 1 candidates. And this really highlights the need to sort of incentivize and fund those studies. As we look at the phase 3 studies, and I'll just highlight a couple of these are really exciting. These are phase 3 studies that are at least in the planning process. And I believe one of which is the M72, which just announced that it's actually going to be funded and start enrollment, I think, this fall, which is very exciting. And Mike pointed out that these phase 3 studies that are ultimately needed for licensure are incredibly expensive. The estimates I've seen for M72 alone are between $200 and $500 million just for those studies. And those don't really include the costs of then bringing those to market and making sure that they're implemented properly. So those are very expensive trials. Oops, do this guy. And I just highlight that here. If we sort of only look at the studies that the candidates that are getting actually into late stage clinical testing, it's a very, very small number. Okay, so the other question is really, is this possible? So this is the recent progress that we've seen with M72, AS01. This was a final analysis of a phase 2B study. Now, keeping in mind that M72 is a subunit vaccine that incorporates 2 synthetic proteins that are done as a fusion protein in conjunction with the GSK adjuvant. Okay, I'm having trouble advancing. Here we go. And just to highlight the study, so this actually showed, this was a study that looked at TB-infected adolescents and young adults. And what you can see over the course of the 2 years or so of follow-up, that we saw about a 50% reduction in cases in those who were infected. Now, one could argue that 50% is not what we're ultimately aiming for, but the fact that this worked in people who were already TB infected is really quite exciting. And this is the first real demonstration of a novel vaccine in over 100 years. Okay, so what's next? I think, as I mentioned, we just announced that we're going to be going to a phase 3 study to look at licensure for this vaccine. This will be taking place over multiple sites. It will include people with and without TB infection, although it's powered largely on the QFT positive individuals, and will also include both people who are HIV plus and minus. And the thing to point out here, and this is just inherent to TB, is it's estimated that this will require about 14,000 participants in high prevalence or high burden settings in order to show efficacy. And for the reason for this is that simply that most people who get exposed to or infected with TB don't develop disease. So we have to be powered to discern that difference in a relatively small number of people. So Mike already showed us that I'm going to skip these slides just because Mike just showed us how short we've come. And Mike showed this as well. And that Let me just compare this to COVID. And I think Mike highlighted this as well, the $121 million that we spent on TB vaccines, and that's opposed to $53,000 million that were spent in COVID over the course of just a year or two. But what COVID highlighted is that when we put our mind to something, we can do it. In the sense that you think, wow, that's a lot of money. But people had a sense of urgency, a sense of concern over COVID, and this that really led to the mobilization of these resources. The other thing I really want to point out is that the funding in this case was largely driven towards the private sector. And I think this is really important, and I think Mike touched on this as well, that at some level, as we sort of go from these early stage concepts to late stage vaccine evaluation, we are going to have significant investments from the private sector in order to make that happen. And just pointing out that $517 million went to the private sector over the course of just a year or two. So just as I conclude, here's my food for thought. So first of all, the science supports the feasibility of TB vaccination, and I think that's incredibly important. That getting to licensure, which is our goal, will require significant investments. And our ambition is sorely lacking. That is, we have to have the capacity to develop novel vaccines. We have to have capacity for clinical trials. And finally, I think developing public-private partnerships is incredibly important. So I'm going to stop there and just thank you guys for doing this. And just to, again, point out that TB VaxArm, I think, is a really nice outlet for TB vaccine advocacy. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, David. I think everyone agrees that this is a really exciting space, and the work that is being done in vaccine development will no doubt be a game changer for ending TB. I can also include some notes for how to join TB VaxArm in the follow-up email if anyone's interested. So thank you again. And now we'll pass it over to Karishma to talk us through TB diagnostics. So I will share your slides for you, Karishma.
Thank you, Leigh. Wonderful. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. So for those of you who are not familiar with FIND, I'll start with a super quick introduction. FIND is an international non-profit organization established in 2003 as a PDP. TB was actually the first disease program that we started working on, and it continues to be one of our largest programs. This year, FIND is marking 20 years since our establishment, and in line with our organizational strategy, our aim as an organization is to ensure that everyone who needs a test can get one. Next slide, please. So in the case of TB, 35% of people with TB do not get diagnosed. And as you can see from the slide, for every disease, there's a diagnostic gap and there's also a treatment gap. So the treatment gap is basically the people who are diagnosed, but they never make it to treatment. In the case of TB, this is about 5%. And you can see that the bigger gap is basically for those who never get diagnosed in the first place. Next slide, please. So we've already heard from some of the other speakers about the pandemic, and what COVID did for diagnostics was that it just put diagnostics and testing in the spotlight and highlighted a very clear investment case for diagnostics. So we know, and it's well established, that diagnostics save lives, they save money, and they also empower countries. So this is a very strong case that we need to invest in diagnostics. Next slide, please. So the TB team at FIND is working hard to reduce TB deaths by 90% by 2030. And for this, we need to ensure that simple and rapid tests for TB should be made available to everybody everywhere. So just to quickly touch upon the currently used TB diagnostics, the most widely used test for TB involves taking a sample of sputum from a person displaying symptoms and identifying TB under a microscope, which is a very ancient practice but continues to be common. The bacteria are then grown in a dish containing anti-TB drugs to see if they are resistant to the most commonly used medicines or not. These tests are not very efficient. They require 2 to 6 weeks to yield a result, and they only detect about half the number of TB cases, and they don't always detect the drug resistance. Additionally, collecting sputum is difficult for certain populations, such as children, people living with HIV, and also remote populations, such as the indigenous communities in Canada. And therefore, we feel that rapid diagnostic tests could be a real game changer. And the WHO as well recommends rapid molecular tests as the first test for a TB diagnostic for people being evaluated for both TB as well as rifampicin-resistant TB. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this very crowded slide, the pipeline of TB tools is looking very promising. But bridging the innovation to implementation gap will require sustained funding, advocacy, and political will. So this looks very positive in terms of outlook, but there are many gaps that still remain, and you'll see that on the subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So every year, 10.6 million people are estimated to get TB. Next slide, please. 450,000 have drug-resistant TB. Next slide. And you can see that 4.2 million people go undiagnosed. Next slide. There are 150,000 people diagnosed for drug-resistant TB, and you can see that from the subset of people that are diagnosed, about 2.4 million are diagnosed with a WHO recommended rapid molecular test. Next slide. And for those that are not diagnosed, or what we call as the missing cases, we really need to target the group of missing cases, rather than group the millions of missing cases with new tools, such as non-sputum sample types, as well as chest x-rays and efficient tools for screening. Next slide. Yeah, you can just click through. And also to highlight that from those that are diagnosed, a lot of these cases, or 4 million cases, are detected, but they're not reached with the currently available rapid molecular tests that are recommended. So we're still using ancient tools. So this slide, and I was asked today to just highlight some of the upcoming and exciting new tools in the pipeline. I unfortunately won't be able to go through all of them, but I think this one is particularly exciting, the tongue swabs, because tongue swabs provide an alternative to sputum samples. And we've seen in COVID that people became quite familiar with using tests, self-tests for COVID. So the idea is that a tongue swab may be able to also in the future open doors for people to get tested on their own and take testing into their own hands, which is something that is not possible right now with the currently available tests. You can just click through. Thank you. And next slide. So coming to molecular diagnostic tests at the point of care, we have different technologies that are available at different levels of the healthcare system. And what our ultimate vision is, and again, this is influenced by what we've learned in COVID. But just to give you an example, when a patient presents themselves at a local clinic, they aren't asking to be tested for TB or malaria. They show up because they're not feeling well, they have symptoms, they have fever, they have a bad headache, and they want to know what's wrong. So in an ideal world, FIND is envisioning a future where we could potentially have multiplex or multi-pathogen testing technologies that can actually be used at the primary healthcare level and that can distinguish what the person has. So moving away from the question, is this COVID, to what is this, is our ultimate aim and what we're working towards. Next slide. And you can click through. So TB chest x-rays have for very long been used as a screening tool, and it's an important tool also for triage and proactive screening for pulmonary TB in adults, children, and people living with HIV. One of the barriers for large-scale implementation of chest x-ray is the need for human readers, who tend to be scarce in high-burden countries. So we're looking now at new technologies of chest x-rays that have been enhanced by computer-aided detection as well as artificial intelligence to be able to play the role that a human reader would play, which could eventually increase the population that is being screened and expand chest X-rays to more people. Next slide. So the last technology that I'd like to highlight is actually sequencing. So targeted next generation sequencing for TB is something that we heard a lot about. In COVID, we heard a lot about sequencing technologies, and TNGS, or targeted NGS for TB, is an area of work that we started working on even prior to COVID. And it's essentially a technology, and you'll hear more in Anna Maria's slides as well about the gaps in drug susceptibility testing, or testing for drug resistant TB. So sequencing is essentially a technology that can fill those gaps and allow us to make treatment decisions for drug resistant TB much faster. Next slide. I won't spend a lot of time on this because both Mike and Dave have given us the background, but we all agree that to end TB, we must find TB and we must fund TB. And we can see from a report done by Policy Cures Research, which is known as the G-Finder report, diagnostics have received a very small share over the last decade or so of global health R&D funding. And we can also see the latest needs and resources of the global plan to end TB, which Mike took us through already. And just to highlight that from 2023 to 2030, TB diagnostics will require almost $8 billion. And finally, to conclude, of course, the TB diagnostics pipeline is exciting, but it's also complex. And in order to achieve our NTB goals, we will have to work closely with our country partners and community to make the right decisions so that we can ensure that everyone who needs the test can get one. Thank you, and thank you, Results Canada and Stop TB Canada, for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much for highlighting some of those tools that are in development. Next up, we are going to shift to kind of the last segment of the care cascade that we're going to cover today, which is TB treatment. We'll have our presentation from Anna Maria that I will share in a moment. There we go. Over to you, Anna Maria.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to be on this call. Just a short introduction about TB Alliance. We are a not-for-profit drug developer, and much like FIND, we are in the category of what's called a product development partnership. So it's essentially a scientific brain trust working on TB therapeutics, but we can't accomplish our work without a cascade and network of partners all over the world. Next slide. TB, the oldest pandemic, and yes, TB is a pandemic. I won't go through this slide, but I think, as we all know, it's a leading infectious disease killer, shortly eclipsed by COVID, but now unfortunately back at the top. When it kills 1.6 million people a year, including 10 million new cases. Next slide. I really like this slide for historical perspective in terms of TB therapeutics over the course of time. You'll see on the left-hand side, sort of golden age of antibiotic development, streptomycin, isoniazid. But as you see, as time goes on after the 1960s, there's really this sort of valley of death. The private sector was exiting the antibiotic space in general, but specifically for TB therapeutics. And you really had a virtually empty pipeline for several decades. And then you see in the 2000s and starting in 2010s, actually 3 drugs that have been approved by a stringent regulatory authority to treat TB. Next slide. Again, why do we need TB treatments? Isn't TB curable? This is a question that we get all the time. Yes, TB is curable, but the treatments for it are really suboptimal. I'll refer to the 146 campaign that TAG has really spearheaded in terms of, ongoing therapeutics, 1 month for latent, 4 months for drug sensitive TB, 6 months for drug resistant TB. These are in fact tremendous achievements, but it's not nearly enough, and it's not an acceptable baseline. Next slide. This very busy slide is the working group on new TB drugs. It sort of consolidates everything that's happening. And I'll say in this case, it's good to have a busy slide. As Dave said, what you really want to see is on the left-hand side in the early discovery, you want to see a full pipeline, because indeed there's a fair amount of attrition. So that funnel gets smaller and smaller as you go to the right-hand side of the slide. But there is significantly more activity in the past 5 years than we've seen previously. Next slide. And this is just the TB Alliance drug development pipeline. Again, it's taken us some time to get here. We have a pretty healthy early lead identification, lead optimization, the early part of the work. Right now, we'd like to see more compounds in phase 1, but there are in fact several compounds in phase 2 and phase 3 trials that have recently concluded. Next slide. Just a final word, especially on regulatory approval and normative guidance. There was an update for the WHO clinical guidelines for TB, really recommending BPA-LM and BPA-L as the preferred treatment for all people with drug-resistant TB. It's 6 months, all oral, and highly effective with a higher than 90% cure rate. Next slide. So where do we go from here, right? So available therapies, again, 4 months plus. What our aspirational goal is really on the right-hand side. Right now, we're looking at a universal small molecule regimen, a universal regimen with novel approaches getting us to 7 to 10 days, probably exceeds the capabilities of antibiotics themselves. I'll say a word about that. But this is where we would really like to get to in terms of the future of TB treatment. But again, I'll just emphasize what my other colleagues have said, and that is we're not going to get anywhere without vaccines and diagnostics. Next slide. Strategies that we are specifically working on for the BPAL regimen, which is the 3-drug regimen for drug-resistant TB. We're looking at how we can optimize that through 2nd-generation compounds. And by that, I mean other drugs in the same class that might be more efficacious and have fewer side effects. Apart from that, we're also looking at novel classes of drugs, novel targets, because especially for TB, you want to hit the bug with as many different tools as you have to find different vulnerabilities and hit it all at the same time. And again, I think to get to an ultra short regimen, we're now looking at what has happened in the oncology space and how immunotherapy, especially using artificial intelligence to get through some of the tools could help us to sort of have a breakthrough. Second bullet is, can we get to a place where there isn't a real distinction or need for distinction between drug resistant and drug sensitive TB? And then again, just reiterating the aspirational goal of an ultra short treatment. Next slide. Again, won't belabor the point, but I will just reiterate what my colleagues have said, is that it's woefully underfunded. And again, the TAG TB research funding trends is a great document if you'd like to do a deeper dive, as well as the GFinder report. Next slide. So I just wanted to say a few words about access and availability, but also about what we can do individually and collectively. Next slide. Just a case study on how we've been able to get optimal therapies to patients. And one good example is in the pediatric space. Previously, TB drugs were administered to children in a really suboptimal way. Adult dose drugs were broken up and crushed, and they were administered through all sorts of other suboptimal ways. We worked to develop a first-line treatment for a correct dissolvable, dispersible FDC for first-line treatment, and it's been a game changer for treating kids with TB. Next slide. So I think the other thing that we've been working on is how can we really, once you have an approved drug regimen, how can you get it into the hands of patients? And I won't go through this slide other than to say that the road to access is full of bottlenecks, pitfalls, and inefficiencies. This, if you add it all up, historically has taken up to 9 years, in no small part because it's often been done in a sequential way. Next slide. What we've really tried to do is see, can we do things in parallel? Can we make some shortcuts that get us through all the steps we need to go through, but in a much more abbreviated time frame? And the answer is we have made some inroads into shortening this timeline. And for the case of BPALM, we're down from 9 years to 3 years through really taking a proactive approach to both regulatory and normative, as well as drug commercialization activities. Next slide. So what you've seen in terms of getting drugs into the hands of patients is a rapid uptick in scale up. Just by way of comparison, bedaquiline, delamanid, pratomanid, you see on that graph on the right-hand side, we've been able to really shorten that timeline and increase the number of patients who have access to treatment. Next slide. Lastly, on affordability, TB Alliance has worked very hard to promote generic competition to drive down price. We've also recently been able to help facilitate what's called an advanced market commitment through an organization called MedAccess based in the United Kingdom. And this is a kind of an insurance, if you will, to guarantee a certain volume, which allows you to lower the price. So we've reduced the price of pratomanid specifically from about $364 for a course to $240 for a 6-month treatment. And it's certainly not nearly enough. So we're working hard to get to the next level of price reduction. Next slide. And lastly, I'd just like to end by sort of a call to action of many call to actions, especially in light of the upcoming UN high-level meeting on TB. There are things that we can do. One of the things that we can do is to sign up for the Fast Track the Cure. It's a petition. It calls on the global community to really step up to the plate in ways that are both resource mobilization focused, but also focused on a political commitment to really focus on TB. And if you just go to the last slide, Leigh, you can go to this QR code, but also go to Fast Track the Cure's website and sign the petition to really show our support to the powers that be and those who are crafting the political declaration on TB for the UN high-level meeting about how important it is to each and every person on this call. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Anna Maria. And I can also include the Fast Track the Cure link in the follow-up email for anyone who didn't get to the QR code in time. So we are nearing the hour. So I just wanted to take 2 minutes to quickly thank our speakers, Mike, David, Karishma, Anna Maria, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our network. It's all been really valuable information that will no doubt support the campaign that we're currently working on, calling on Canada to invest in TB R&D. So before I open it up for maybe 1 or 2 questions, if we have time, I just want to reiterate Stop TB Canada, Stop and Results Canada's campaign ahead of the United Nations high-level meeting on TB that's happening this September. For the past couple of months, we've been calling on Canada to meet its fair share contribution to TB R&D and to announce new funding to support the development of new tools like those that we heard about today across TB prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. The fair share that Mike mentioned at the beginning of the call is defined at committing 0.15% of Canada's total research budget to TB. So we need Canada to do its part to support this innovation. And we're calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to announce this funding at the UN high-level meeting. You can join us by taking action with us. We'll share a quick click to tweet in the chat if you'd like to take action right now. And like I mentioned, I will follow up with an email with some more instructions on ways that you can get involved with this campaign. So maybe I will leave it there. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at hello@stoptbcanada.com. And maybe we have time, if anyone has a pressing question, you can use the raise hand function, and we'll see if we can get to that. No. All right. I might have missed a question in the chat, so just unmute if you're trying to ask a question. Otherwise, I will leave it there. We'll follow up with an email to everyone who registered. Oh, Robin, was that a hand?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question because it's always nice to hear from the audience before you close out. So I was just curious to hear a little bit from Mike and maybe others on the call about the recent big news related to access to Brachylen through the Global Drug Facility and the role that advocates have played in making that moment a success. Just anything we can take inspiration from that experience to take forward in our work after today would be helpful.
Yeah, it's a great question. So those of you who are active on Twitter or fans of the YA novelist John Green probably found it, impossible to escape a kind of groundswell of advocacy for access to one of the newer TB drugs, bedaquiline, which is manufactured by Johnson & Johnson and went off patent last week. John Green rallied his followers to urge the company to commit to broaden access to the drug by not enforcing secondary patents that would limit access to cheaper generic versions in high TB burden countries, even after the primary patent expired a week ago. And I think for me, what the takeaway was first, Twitter advocacy is not quite dead yet, despite what Elon Musk is doing to his own platform, because a lot of the advocacy took place there. And it was just amazing to see this kind of maybe what is becoming like an old school kind of social media campaign just be so effective. But it was also for me as someone who's been in TB advocacy for over 10 years now and is beginning to feel like an old dog, to see so many people take action on TB and jump in and begin to talk about this issue. And the conversation has continued well beyond just that social media campaign. And this these are people who are not like TB advocates. It's not like those of us on the line today. It really is, his fans and those who've connected with him. And I think it for me stands out as a moment where we've had a kind of public recognition of the importance of TB, and it's come at just the right time. And demonstrates that our issue can have public salience and resonance and go beyond just sort of our more narrow activist circles. So I think John Green has some other things planned over the coming year. Follow his YouTube channel to see where that goes. And for all of us, I think it's just a demonstration that the advocacy that we do really can have a far reach when we do it well. I don't know if others want to kind of add to that, but it was an incredible moment for sure.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, it was super exciting to see it all unfold on Twitter and to see TB trending on Twitter, as that doesn't happen very often. Any other questions before we leave the call? All right, we'll leave it there then. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our speakers for a really great overview of TB R&D, where we're at and the game changers that are in development right now. Good luck everyone in your advocacy, and enjoy the rest of your day and week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.